Please be seated. Today's stories take us from the ruined roads of Zion and the exile of the Jewish people to the missionary roads of Paul and the early Christians. Today's stories move across centuries and through different languages. Today's stories speak both to crowds and also to the small band of Jesus' friends. Yet throughout this spectrum of stories, we hear about faith. The same small faith. The same small faith that abides in the individual hearts across continents, and the same small faith that resides in the gathered communities throughout time. You may have noticed we heard not one but two laments today, and yet in those verses we hear the same small faith speaking to the widowed city's plight and of the steadfast love of the Lord. We hear of the same small faith in the letter of Paul and in the Gospel of Luke. The same small faith lives in Lois and Eunice, as in their grandson, son Timothy. The same small faith dwells in the apostles. But today, those disciples want to ask for a little bit more. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." The Lord replied, "If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you." It's easy to hear exasperation in these words from Jesus. And we know that the disciples were exasperating folks sometimes. But what if we look at those same words on the page from the perspective and holding in mind what we know about God? God's generosity, God's mercy, God's steadfast love. We might hear these same words differently. It's possible, and I know this because this is actually a 5th grade lesson that I teach. So if 5th graders can do it, we can too. Here's the lesson. Sometimes the same words mean something different when you use a different tone. So that there is a difference between, "Why did you do that?" and, "Why did you do that? Tell me more." Same words, different conversation. More than one scholar has proposed that we could hear Jesus saying, with kindness, maybe even with a small smile, "Why, you do not need more faith. Even this much is enough. Enough. You are enough. You have enough." The same small faith is enough. Enough is kind of a magical word. The disciples, the bereaved widow, Timothy, you and I, we have enough faith. We have enough. Enough faith even to uproot trees? Well, we might actually need our small but enough faith to do some different landscaping work. Perhaps, just perhaps, you have recently felt overwhelmed. I may be going out on a limb here, but perhaps, just maybe, you have felt within the last days, weeks, months, beleaguered at times by the challenges we face. Racial injustice, climate change, poverty, this election. Anyone? And that's just the public list. And then there are the private lists that we carry. The bills, the impossible schedule with no margins, the diagnosis, the news. It's all enough too. Enough to leave us feeling crushed before we've even gotten started some days. And the landscape that we look out on is full of reasons for each and every one of us to feel exhausted, seeing the weeds and the thorns, not to mention that misplaced mulberry tree. The answer, we're sure, is not to pull the curtains, shut the door, and turn our backs on the work. We know that. But the answer is also not to tackle it all. You are not in charge of the whole vista. With mustard seed-sized faith, we can do the small work that's right in front of us. The small work of tending to our family and today's task. The small work of digging in and having that one conversation, and that's all. The small work of looking at the decisions we face and making them. Making the one, taking the step, and then making the next one. This is small work, really, and our small faith is actually enough. Moving one mulberry tree can indeed change the whole landscape. Mustard seed-sized faith is all we need to do the small work that is ours, our corner of the garden, our little patch in the kingdom. This faith, this small seed-sized faith that we have, is not just some wishful thinking, but this is hopeful or maybe hope-fueled work. This faith looks at the world as it is and sees it all, the weeds and the trees and the mess. But this faith also sees more, sees currently invisible possibilities that could be made real with just an afternoon's worth of small work. And this small faith trusts that the small work of each dedicated soul will add up and be enough. Archbishop Tutu, a pretty small man actually, although with a great big heart, says this: do your little bit of good where you are. That's all. It's the little bits of good put together that will overwhelm the world. So friends, we do not have to be overwhelmed by the world. We can overwhelm it with small faith and a little bit of work. We can trust this to be true because we've heard the stories today from Zion, from the Mediterranean coast, from Paul, from your story, from mine, from ancient Judah to 21st century Memphis, from Lois to your own grandmother, in all kinds of languages in every corner of the kingdom. It's the same small faith that has carried widows and children and disciples and prophets through catastrophe and celebration. And it carries us. And you good folk at Calvary know a good thing about that, about your history and the faith that has carried you this far. Just the other day, I watched the beautiful little video that you have speaking to this place and what it means and this community. And did you notice? It opens with a woman pulling some weeds from a planter. One person doing her small work. It adds up. Today's stories ask us to consider reaching into our pockets for just a small bit of faith and to believe that what we pull out will be enough in order to do our small work. The small work of loving the person in front of us, of listening to one forgotten man's story, of telling the truth, of taking a breath, of writing a letter, of voting, of sweeping just a little bit beyond your own driveway. We can indeed uproot mulberry trees and replant them in new places. We can indeed change the landscape in small ways with the small faith that we have. The same small faith that echoes in today's stories and in my story and in yours.